Have you ever prayed and felt nothing back? Have you begged God for an answer and heard only silence? And then, slowly, quietly, did something bitter begin to grow in that silence? For 18 years, Teresa of Avila lived in that exact place. 18 years of dryness. 18 years where prayer felt like dragging stones uphill. She entered the Carmelite convent of the Incarnation in Avila on November 1st, 1535. She was 20 years old. The convent held 140 nuns. Most of them wore jewelry. They arranged their veils to look attractive. Visitors came and went. Parties happened in the parlor. Young men showed up. Gossip floated through the halls like smoke. Teresa fit right in. She was charming. Everyone liked her. She liked being liked. And God? God felt distant, far away, unreachable. She tried to pray. She failed. She tried again. She failed again. Her mind wandered. Distractions crushed her. She would sit for an hour and count the minutes. Later she wrote, "I was more anxious for the hour of prayer to be over than I was to remain there. I do not know what heavy penance I would not have gladly undertaken rather than practice prayer." 18 years. From age 21 to age 39. That is how long she lived in spiritual dryness. That is how long she waited for God to show up. That is how long she felt abandoned. And here is what nobody tells you about waiting that long. Resentment starts to whisper. If you value documented Catholic history and the lives of the saints like this, subscribe. It is the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you are hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from the Catholic Encyclopedia, maintained by New Advent and containing historical documentation on Teresa's life compiled by multiple scholars, and the book of her life, Teresa's own autobiography, completed in 1565, where she documented every detail of her spiritual struggle under obedience to her confessors. These are not legends. These are her own words, preserved in manuscripts, verified by the Carmelite order, and studied for 400 years. Now back to the information. During those 18 years, Teresa gave up. Not officially, not publicly, but internally she stopped praying. She used her illness as an excuse. She was sick, often. Severe illnesses, seizures, paralysis for 3 years, pain that never left. She told herself she could not pray because she was too sick, too distracted, too unworthy. But underneath that excuse, something darker was forming. She began to resent God for not showing up. She began to resent the graces he gave to others. She began to resent the whole system of prayer that seemed to work for everyone except her. This is what happens when you wait on God and he does not answer. The silence turns into accusation. The unanswered prayer turns into bitterness. And bitterness, Teresa would later discover, is not just painful, it is lethal to the soul. In 1554, something broke. Teresa was 39 years old. She was walking through a hallway in the convent. She saw a statue. It was Christ at the pillar, scourged, bleeding, broken. She looked at it, and for the first time in 18 years, she felt something move inside her. She fell to her knees. She wept. She described it later as a conversion, as if she had been spiritually dead and was suddenly violently brought back to life. But the conversion was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a war. God began to visit her with visions, not physical visions, intellectual visions, things seen directly in her mind without any external sense involved. Voices that spoke without sound, revelations that burned into her soul like brands. She saw Christ. She saw hell. She saw the Blessed Trinity living inside her own soul like 3 flames in one fire. And the whole city of Avila lost their minds. Confessors told her the visions were from the devil. Saintly laymen, men she trusted, examined her and said the same thing. The manifestations are the work of the evil spirit. You are deceived. You are under attack. Stop praying. The more she tried to resist the visions, the stronger they became. The more she tried to obey her confessors and shut them down, the more powerfully God worked in her soul. This is the cost of resentment. It blinds you to grace even when grace is right in front of you. Teresa had spent 18 years resenting God's silence. Now God was speaking, and she could not recognize his voice because resentment had taught her to expect nothing. In the year 1558, Teresa saw hell, not as a metaphor, not as a teaching. She saw it. She wrote about it later in the book of her life, chapter 32. The description is so vivid that even now, reading it makes your skin crawl. She found herself in a long, narrow passage, like a furnace. Very low, very dark, very confined. The ground was saturated with water, filthy mud. It sent out a pestilential odor. The mud was covered with loathsome vermin. At the end of the passage was a hollow place in the wall, like a closet. And in that closet, she saw herself confined. She felt fire in her soul, not metaphorical fire, actual fire. She could not describe it. Her bodily sufferings were unendurable. The walls closed in on her. She could not breathe. There was no light. Everything was thick darkness. She wrote, "I do not understand how it is." Though there was no light, yet everything that can give pain by being seen was visible. The worst part? The despair. The absolute knowledge that there was no hope, no consolation, no escape, ever. She understood in that moment why she had been shown this vision. She was being given a glimpse of the place reserved for her if she had continued in resentment, if she had continued to turn away from prayer, if she had continued to hold grudges against God for his silence. Years later, she would write that this vision was one of the greatest mercies God ever gave her. It terrified her so completely that she could never again take spiritual complacency lightly. It broke something in her. The resentment died that day, but the war was just beginning. In 1562, Teresa founded the first Reformed Carmelite convent. She called it Saint Joseph. It was dedicated to absolute poverty. No jewelry, no visitors, no parties, just prayer. Silence, austerity. The citizens of Avila erupted. The authorities tried to shut her down. Her own Carmelite superiors ordered her to stop. The convent was in peril of suppression. But Teresa had learned something in those 18 years of dryness. She had learned that waiting on God does not mean passivity. It means obedience without resentment. It means action without bitterness. It means trust when everything in you screams that God has abandoned you. She kept going. She founded convent after convent. Medina del Campo in 1567, Malagan and Valladolid in 1568, Toledo and Pastrana in 1569, Salamanca in 1570, Alba de Tormes in 1571, Segovia in 1574, Villas and Seville in 1575, Caravaca in 1576. Every single foundation faced violent opposition. Every single one seemed impossible. Every single one succeeded. And then in 1576, the storm hit. The unreformed Carmelites turned on her. They began to persecute Teresa, her supporters, and her reforms. The general chapter at Piacenza forbade all further founding of reformed convents. They instructed Teresa to go into voluntary retirement. She obeyed. She chose St. Joseph at Toledo. Meanwhile, her friends were subjected to attacks. Some were imprisoned, some were tortured. Father Jerome Gratian, her closest collaborator, was thrown into prison by the order. Father John of the Cross, who had joined her reform, was kidnapped by Carmelite friars and locked in a cell so small he could not stand upright. They whipped him regularly. They gave him almost no food. They kept him in darkness. For 4 years, the persecution continued. 4 years of watching everything she had built threatened with annihilation. 4 years of false accusations. 4 years of seeing her friends suffer. And this is where the real test came. Not in the 18 years of dryness, not in the founding of convents, but here, in the moment when resentment would have been justified. Teresa could have turned bitter. She could have raged against the injustice. She could have demanded vindication. She could have held grudges against the men who tortured her spiritual sons and daughters. Instead, she wrote a letter. The year was 1579. It was addressed to a Carmelite nun who was suffering persecution. The letter is preserved in the collection of Teresa's correspondence. Scholars call it Letter 267. It contains one of the most devastating pieces of spiritual advice ever written. In order to profit and advance by means of persecutions and injuries, it is well to reflect that God has been offended by them before I have. When the blow strikes me, he has already been offended by the sin. The soul that loves its bridegroom ought already to have pledged itself to be entirely his and to have no will of its own. And if he bears with the injury, why should we resent it? Read that again. If he bears with the injury, why should we resent it? This is the opposite of everything resentment teaches. Resentment says, you have been wronged. You deserve to be angry. You deserve to hold on to this pain. You deserve vindication. Teresa says, God was offended first. God chose to bear it patiently. If you resent the injury, you are setting yourself against God's own patience. The letter was written during one of the darkest periods of Teresa's life. She and many of her closest friends were being dealt with in a very unjust manner. Ridicule, calumny, imprisonment, torture. All of it was aimed at people whose only crime was wanting to return to a more disciplined life and a more fervent pursuit of mental prayer. The temptation to indulge in righteous indignation and resentment would have been very tangible, extremely real, extremely justified. But Teresa understood something most people never learn. Resentment and bitterness destroy the beatitude that might otherwise be ours in the midst of persecution. These preoccupations of heart dissipate our spiritual strength. She was not talking theory. She was talking from experience. She had lived through 18 years of spiritual dryness where resentment nearly killed her soul. She had seen the place in hell reserved for those who turn away from God in bitterness. She knew what happens when you let resentment fester. And now, in the middle of persecution, she was choosing the opposite. She was choosing to release every grievance. She was choosing to trust God's timing. She was choosing to believe that his silence was not abandonment. On January 31st, 1579, Teresa wrote another letter. This one was to her nuns in Seville. The prioress there, Maria de San Jose, had been unjustly deposed from office by Diego de Cardenas, the provincial of the unreformed Carmelites in Andalusia. False accusations had been made against her by another sister, Beatriz de la Madre de Dios. The situation was a disaster. The nuns were devastated. Teresa sent the letter through the prior of the Carthusians to avoid it being confiscated. In it, she wrote, "Bring honor to the daughters of the Blessed Virgin, your sisters in this great persecution, for if you help one another, the good Jesus will help you. Even though he sleeps at sea, when the storm gathers strength, he calms the winds." He wants us to ask of him, and he loves us so much that he is always looking for ways to be of benefit to us. She continued, "Strive to be joyful and reflect that, if carefully considered, all that is suffered for so good a God, who suffered so much for us, is small, for you have not reached the point of shedding your blood for him. You are among your sisters and not in Algiers." Algiers? That was where Christians were taken as slaves by Muslims and often martyred. Teresa was saying, you are not being killed, you are not in chains, you are suffering injustice, yes, but you are still alive. You are still together, you are still free to pray. Do not let resentment rob you of what you still have. In April of 1579, the tide finally turned. The discalced Carmelites were removed from the jurisdiction of the unreformed Carmelites. Father Angel de Salazar became their superior. The cases before the Inquisition against Teresa, Gratian, and others were dropped. On June 22, 1580, the province of Discalced Carmelites was approved and canonically established with the support of King Philip II of Spain. Teresa was 65 years old. Her health was broken. She had traveled thousands of miles on foot and by cart. She had founded 17 convents. She had endured 4 years of brutal persecution. She had watched her friends tortured. She had been slandered, mocked, and threatened with the Inquisition. And she had refused to become bitter. This is the mystery Teresa saw. Resentment does not just damage your relationship with the person who wronged you. It damages your relationship with God. Because when you hold on to bitterness, you are essentially saying, God, you are handling this wrong. You should have intervened. You should have stopped this. You are late. You are absent. You do not care. That is what resentment whispers. And if you listen long enough, it will destroy your faith entirely. Teresa knew this because she had lived it. For 18 years, she had listened to that whisper. For 18 years, she had believed God did not care. For 18 years, she had turned away from prayer because the silence felt like rejection. And then God showed her what the path led to. Hell. Not because God was punishing her for being hurt, but because resentment, left unchecked, turns into something monstrous. It turns into pride. It turns into self-righteousness. It turns into a total rejection of God's sovereignty. Teresa wrote about it in The Interior Castle, her masterwork on the spiritual life. The book was written in 1577 while she was in voluntary exile at St. Joseph in Toledo. She described the soul as a castle made of crystal or diamond, containing 7 mansions. The first mansions are the entry point. The soul is still distracted by the world, still struggling with sin, still easily pulled away from prayer. The danger in the first mansions? Giving up, turning away. Letting resentment convince you that prayer does not work, that God does not listen, that waiting is pointless. Teresa wrote, "If you realize your pitiable condition, how can you refrain from trying to remove the darkness from the crystal of your souls? Remember, if death should take you now, you would never again enjoy the light of this sun." She was saying, do not let resentment blind you. Do not let bitterness convince you that the darkness is permanent. Keep going, keep praying, keep waiting. Even if you feel nothing, even if God seems absent, even if 18 years pass, and you still have not heard his voice. Because the silence is not abandonment. The waiting is not rejection. The dryness is not proof that God does not care. Sometimes God is silent because he is waiting for the resentment to die. Sometimes he withholds consolation because consolation would feed the very thing that is killing you. Sometimes the dark night is the only way to burn out the bitterness. Teresa experienced this firsthand. For 18 years she waited. For 18 years she received no consolation. For 18 years she felt abandoned. And then, when the resentment finally died, when she finally surrendered, when she finally stopped demanding that God show up on her terms, the floodgates opened. The visions came. The mystical experiences came. The union with God came. But here's the thing. The experiences were not the point. The union was not the reward. The point was the death of resentment. The point was learning to trust God without feeling. The point was learning to wait without bitterness. In 1580, Teresa made more foundations. Villanueva de la Jara and Palencia. In 1581, Soria. In 1582, Granada through her assistant, the Venerable Anne of Jesus. And Burgos. She left Burgos at the end of July 1582. She stopped at Palencia, Valladolid, and Medina del Campo. She reached Alba de Tormes in September. She was suffering intensely. Her body was failing. She took to her bed. On October 4th, 1582, Teresa died. She was 67 years old. The following day, owing to the reform of the calendar by Pope Gregory XIII, was reckoned as October 15th. Her body was transferred to Avila after some years, but later reconveyed to Alba, where it is still preserved incorrupt. Her heart, showing the marks of the transverberation she experienced in a vision, is exposed to the veneration of the faithful. 40 years after her death, in 1622, Teresa was canonized by Pope Gregory XV. On September 27, 1970, Pope Paul VI proclaimed Teresa the first female doctor of the Church in recognition of her centuries-long spiritual legacy to Catholicism. But here's what most people miss about Teresa's story. The greatest miracle was not the visions. The greatest miracle was not the incorrupt body. The greatest miracle was not even the reform of the Carmelite order. The greatest miracle was that Teresa waited 18 years in dryness and did not become bitter. She could have. She had every reason to. God was silent. Prayer was torture. The spiritual life felt like a lie. Every single condition was in place for resentment to take root and destroy her. But she kept going. Not because she felt anything, not because she had consolations, not because she had proof that God was listening. She kept going because she chose to believe that the silence was not rejection. And when the persecution came, when the attacks came, when her friends were tortured and her work was threatened with destruction, she did not turn bitter. She did not hold grudges. She did not demand vindication. Instead, she wrote letters telling her nuns to rejoice. She wrote letters reminding them that God had been offended first. She wrote letters saying, "If he bears with the injury, why should we resent it?" This is the lesson Teresa left us. Waiting on God is not passive. It is not weak. It is not resignation. Waiting on God is active warfare against resentment. It is a daily, hourly, minute-by-minute choice to trust when everything in you screams that God has abandoned you. Resentment will tell you that you deserve better. Resentment will tell you that God owes you an explanation. Resentment will tell you that the silence means he does not care. Teresa says, no. The silence means he is testing your love. The waiting means he is burning out the bitterness. The dryness means he is teaching you to trust him without feeling. And if you can endure that, if you can wait without resentment, if you can suffer persecution without turning bitter, then you will discover what Teresa discovered. God was never absent. He was right there, bearing the injury, enduring the sin, waiting for you to stop demanding and start trusting. Teresa wrote one more thing in the interior castle that almost no one remembers. She wrote about the seventh mansion, the deepest place in the soul where God dwells. She said that when you finally reach that place, when you finally experience union with God, the first thing you realize is that he was there all along. The whole journey, every dark night, every unanswered prayer, every moment of dryness, he was right there, not punishing you, not testing you, not abandoning you, just waiting for the resentment to die so he could show you what had always been true. You were never alone. The silence was not rejection. The waiting was not wasted. And the resentment was the only thing standing between you and the God who had been there all along. But before we get to her deathbed, there is one more documented case that shows exactly how resentment operates in the spiritual life. And it involves a person Teresa tried to save. In the book of her life, Teresa describes a moment that happened while she was in choir. She became profoundly recollected. She went out so the other sisters would not notice, but the sisters near her heard the sound of heavy blows where she was standing. Teresa herself heard voices, as if persons were in consultation, but she could not make out what they were saying. She was so absorbed in prayer that she understood nothing. She was not afraid. This happened almost always when our Lord was pleased that some soul or other, persuaded by Teresa, advanced in the spiritual life. But once, something different happened. There came to her a person who had been living in mortal sin for 2 years and a half. The sin was of the most abominable nature Teresa had ever heard. This person had continued going to Mass, continued going to communion, all while living in this state. The person came to Teresa for confession, for guidance, for help. And Teresa, with all her mystical gifts, with all her visions, with all her experience of God, looked at this soul and saw something that terrified her. She saw the resentment, not toward other people, toward God. This person resented God for allowing the circumstances that led to the sin. This person resented God for not intervening sooner. This person resented God for the suffering that followed the sin. And that resentment had hardened into something so dark, so twisted, that it was preventing the person from truly repenting. Teresa understood in that moment that the sin was not the real problem. The resentment was. The sin could be forgiven in an instant. The resentment was going to take years to uproot. She took the person on as a spiritual child. She prayed. She counseled. She watched as, slowly, painfully, the resentment began to break. It took time. It took brutal honesty. It took the person finally admitting that they had been blaming God for their own choices. And when the resentment died, the healing came. Fast, complete, total. Teresa wrote about this case because she wanted people to understand something crucial. Sin is serious. Sin damages the soul. But resentment is worse, because sin can be confessed, sin can be forgiven, sin can be healed. Resentment refuses to be healed. Resentment holds on to the wound. Resentment nurses the injury. Resentment demands that God explain himself before it will let go. And as long as resentment is there, grace cannot flow, healing cannot come. God is locked out not by his choice, but by yours. In 1565, Teresa finished writing her autobiography. She wrote it under obedience to her confessor. She did not want to write it. She complained that the task kept her from spinning. She submitted everything to the judgment of her confessor and the church. She wrote without self-love or pride. Toward her persecutors, she was respectful, representing them as honest servants of God. But in that autobiography, she included every painful detail of her 18 years of dryness. She included the resentment she felt. She included the time she gave up on prayer. She included her excuses, her failures, her turning away from God. Why? Because she wanted people to know that resentment is not unique to terrible sinners. It is not unique to people who have suffered great injustices. Resentment is the default response of the human heart when God does not show up on our terms. And if someone like Teresa, someone who became a doctor of the church, someone who experienced mystical union with God, someone who founded 17 convents and reformed an entire religious order, if someone like that struggled with resentment, then you are going to struggle with it too. The question is not whether resentment will come. The question is what you will do when it does. Teresa also wrote about another danger that comes with resentment. In The Interior Castle, she describes what happens to souls who reach the second mansion and then turn back. The second mansion is where the soul has started to hear God's call. Prayer is no longer completely foreign. The spiritual life has started to make sense. But the soul is still caught between the attractions of the world and the pull toward God. This is the most dangerous place, because this is where resentment has the most power. The soul knows enough about God to have expectations. The soul has tasted enough of prayer to know what consolation feels like. And when the consolation stops, when the dryness comes, when God seems to withdraw, resentment rushes in like a flood. Teresa says that in the second mansion, the soul must wage war with Satan. Not physical war, spiritual war. The battle is between falsehood and truth, between sin and virtue, between self-gratification and generosity. And the primary weapon Satan uses? Resentment. He whispers, "You tried prayer and it did not work. You gave God a chance and he let you down. You opened your heart and he left you empty. Why keep trying? Why keep suffering? Why keep waiting for a God who clearly does not care?" Teresa says the only way to survive the second mansion is perseverance. Not feelings, not consolations, not proof that God is listening, just perseverance. Keep praying even when it feels pointless. Keep waiting even when it feels like abandonment. Keep trusting even when every emotion in you screams that God has forgotten you. Because the alternative is to turn back. And if you turn back from the second mansion, you do not just return to where you were. You fall hard, fast, and often you fall further than you were before you started. Teresa saw this happen to people. She watched souls who had started to advance in prayer give up because of resentment. She watched them turn bitter. She watched them convince themselves that the spiritual life was a lie. And she watched them spiral into darkness that was worse than anything they had experienced before they started seeking God. This is why she was so adamant about the danger of resentment. It is not just that resentment makes you unhappy. It is not just that resentment damages relationships. Resentment in the spiritual life is a trap door to hell. It opens under you when you least expect it. And once you fall through, climbing back out is almost impossible. Teresa also dealt with resentment in her nuns. She founded 17 convents between 1562 and 1582. That is 17 communities of women, many of them young, many of them from wealthy families, many of them unused to the poverty and austerity Teresa demanded. They entered the convent expecting a life of prayer and peace. What they got was cold, hunger, manual labor, and long hours of silence. Some of them thrived. Others began to resent. They resented Teresa for bringing them to this place. They resented God for calling them to this life. They resented the lack of consolation in prayer. Teresa dealt with it head on. She did not coddle them. She did not soften the rule. She did not promise that the resentment would go away if they just prayed harder. Instead, she told them the truth. The resentment is the test. The resentment is the fire that burns away everything that is not pure love. If you let the resentment win, you will leave. And if you leave, you will regret it for the rest of your life. Some of them stayed, some of them left. The ones who stayed became saints. The ones who left became cautionary tales. There was one nun in particular, at the convent in Seville. Her name is not recorded in Teresa's letters, but her story is. She was talented, intelligent, devout. She entered the convent with pure intentions. But within a year, the dryness hit. Prayer became torture. The silence became oppressive, and the resentment began to whisper. Teresa saw it happening. She wrote to the prioress, Maria de San Jose, and warned her. This sister is in danger. The resentment is taking root. You need to intervene now before it is too late. But before the prioress could act, the unreformed Carmelites deposed her. Diego de Cardenas took over. Beatriz de la Madre de Dios, the sister who had made false accusations, was appointed prioress. And the sister who had been struggling with resentment, she found an ally, someone who validated her bitterness, someone who agreed that Teresa's rule was too harsh, that God was asking too much, that they deserved better. Within 6 months, that sister left the convent. Teresa received word of it in a letter. She wept, not because the sister had left, but because she knew what was coming. The sister had chosen resentment over trust, and that choice would haunt her. Years later, after Teresa's death, that same sister wrote to the Carmelite order asking to be readmitted. She had spent years outside the convent trying to find peace. She could not. The resentment she had nursed had turned into something monstrous. It had poisoned every relationship. It had destroyed her peace. It had left her isolated, bitter, and broken. She was allowed back into the order, but she never regained what she had lost. The years of resentment had done damage that could not be undone. She lived out her days in a different convent, never again experiencing the joy she had felt in her first months with Teresa. Teresa told this story to her other nuns as a warning. Resentment is not a small thing. It is not just a mood. It is not something you can indulge and then shake off when you are ready. Resentment is a cancer. It grows, it spreads, it kills. On her deathbed, Teresa spoke her last words. They are recorded by the nuns who were present. She said, "O my Lord and my spouse, the hour that I have longed for has come. It is time for us to meet one another. No bitterness, no resentment, no accusation. Just pure love for the God who had been silent for 18 years and then spoke for 28 more. That is what happens when resentment dies. That is what happens when you wait on God without demanding. That is what happens when you endure persecution without turning bitter. You discover that the waiting was not wasted. The silence was not abandonment. And the God you thought had forgotten you had been right there all along, bearing every injury, enduring every sin, waiting for you to trust him." Teresa saw what happens when waiting on God turns into resentment. She saw the place reserved for souls who give up, who turn away, who let bitterness destroy them. And then she chose the opposite. She chose to wait. She chose to trust. She chose to endure persecution without bitterness. And in the end, she became one of the greatest saints the church has ever known, not because of her visions, not because of her mystical experiences, but because she refused to let resentment kill what God was building in the silence. After Teresa's death, her letters were preserved by the Carmelite order against her own wishes. She had requested that they be destroyed, but her superiors overruled her. Today, those letters are housed in archives across Spain and Rome, studied by scholars, translated into dozens of languages, and read by millions of people who are trying to figure out how to wait on God without going insane. The answer is in letter 267, written in 1579 to an anonymous Carmelite nun. If he bears with the injury, why should we resent it? That one sentence contains the entire secret. God has already been offended. God has already suffered. God has already borne the weight of every sin, every betrayal, every injustice. He chose to endure it patiently. If you choose resentment, you are setting yourself against his own patience. You're choosing a different path than the one he walked, and that path leads to hell. Not because God is punishing you, but because resentment, by its very nature, separates you from the God who endured everything without bitterness. Teresa understood this because she had almost walked that path herself. For 18 years, she teetered on the edge. For 18 years, resentment whispered in her ear. And then God showed her the cliff. He showed her where that path ended, and she turned around. She chose trust over bitterness. She chose patience over resentment. She chose to wait without demanding. And the waiting changed everything.